Torchbearers of History, a connected series of historical sketches by Amelia Hutchinson Stirling. Chapter 5. Richard Coeur de Lion, the Crusades. While the Cid was fighting against the Arabs in Spain, another people had conquered them in Asia, and had taken the great city of Baghdad. The Turks had conquered Baghdad in 1055. They were a people who came from the center of Asia, who about this time rose to a great power, to such indeed that they more than once ventured to invade the Roman Empire of the East, and to meet the army of the Romans in battle. One emperor of the East even asked them to help him against the Normans, who were attacking the empire. It was about this time that the Turks conquered the Holy Land, and Jerusalem fell into their hands. Before that time it had been held by the Arabs, who, although they were not Christians, did not interfere with or ill-treat in any way the Christian pilgrims who used to flock to Jerusalem to visit the Holy Sepulchre. And we are even told that the great Caliph of Baghdad, Harun al-Rashid, of whom you will read so much in the Arabian Nights, presented the key of the Holy Sepulchre to Charlemagne. The Turks, however, acted quite differently, and no sooner were they in possession of Jerusalem than they began to treat the Christian pilgrims with the greatest cruelty. The complaints of the pilgrims spread all over Europe, and in the hearts of the Christians in every country were stirred with anger and indignation. A great army, led by the nobles of every Christian country of Europe, among which was Robert of Normandy, eldest son of William the Conqueror, was gathered together, and set out for the Holy Land to retake it from the Turks, and to protect the Holy Sepulchre and the Christian pilgrims. The war that followed was the First Crusade, or War of the Cross. Every man who fought in the war had a cross marked on his right shoulder. I am not going to tell you here the story of the First Crusade. A great deal of blood was spilt in it, and a great many lives were lost, but it was the means of stirring up and calling forth what was the noblest thing in the Middle Ages, the spirit of chivalry and knighthood. If it is true that the ideal of the Romans was the old freedom of Rome, it is true that the ideal of noble young men of the Middle Ages was chivalry and knightliness, and this meant a good deal. It means courage and military skill, and above all, honor. Every youth of noble family and noble nature nourished in his heart the ambition to become a knight, or to win his spurs, as it was called. And the spurs were not so easily won, not till he had seen some hard service in the field, or had done some act of unusual daring, living meanwhile a life unspoiled by dishonor, could the ambitious youth hope to wear them. The vows which the young knight was called upon to make at the time of the Crusades were like a religious oath. He was required to undertake to support the cause of Christianity, to guard his own honor sacredly, to help the weak against the strong, and to be the champion of women. There were many noble young knights in the army of the Crusades, and wonderful were the feats of arms which some of them performed. In the end were rewarded by success. The Holy City fell into their hands in 1099, nearly 3 years after they had first started. During the years that followed, several Christian nobles reigned in turn as king of Jerusalem, and 2 bodies of Christian knights, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitalis, were formed to help protect the new Christian kingdom. But the Mohammedans gradually became too strong for the small body of Christians, and at last, in 1187, they again took Jerusalem, just 88 years after it had been taken by the Crusaders. It was after this that the Third Crusade took place, in which our king, Richard Coeur de Lion, so much distinguished himself. Richard is one of the favourite heroes of English history, thanks rather to wonderful stories which had gathered around his name, rather than to actual fact. Handsome and powerful, and more than usually daring and courageous, He is just the kind of man about whom the old poets love to sing and weave marvellous tales of adventure. He himself had picked up some knowledge of music and verse-making from the minstrels of the south of France, where he spent his youth. But in spite of this, and other accomplishments, in spite, too, of his great courage, I do not think that Richard was quite the ideal Christian knight. Indeed, I think he was just a bold, daring, passionate Northman, like his ancestor Rollo, with some external polish of civilization, with a warm zeal for the cause of the Christian religion, and above all, with a burning desire for military glory. On the death of his father, Henry II, he became King of England in 1189, and no sooner was he crowned than he began to make preparations for the Crusade by selling whatever he could, lay his land and offices, and whatever men would give money for what he sold. He was heard to say that he would sell London, the capital of his kingdom, to get money. To William, King of Scotland, who had become the vassal of Henry II, he sold his freedom from English sovereignty. In 1190 he met Philip, King of France, and the two kings, with an army of 100,000 men, set out for the Holy Land. They passed winter in the island of Sicily, where feelings of jealousy broke out between them, which only became stronger with time. In the spring of 1191 they set sail from Sicily for the Holy Land. The English fleet was driven against the island of Cyprus. The King of Cyprus was guilty of ill-treating some of the shipwrecked crews. To punish him, Richard attacked and took Cyprus, deposed the king, and then sold the island to Guy de Lusignan, who was at the time called King of Jerusalem, and whose family reigned afterwards in Cyprus for 300 years. When Richard landed at last in the east coast of the Mediterranean, he found Guy de Lusignan at the head of an army composed largely of pilgrims from Europe, engaged in besieging a town of Acre, which you will see marked on your map. The siege had lasted for more than 2 years, and the Christians were suffering great hardships, which were increased by the breaking out amongst them a terrible plague. Some German merchants there, who came from the coast of the Baltic Sea, had done what they could for the sufferers by making tents out of their sails. These men were afterwards formed into a body of knights, like the Knights Templar, and they were called the Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights afterwards founded the modern kingdom of Prussia. When Richard reached Acre, he was laid up with a fever, but so impatient was he to be in the thick of the battle, that ill though he was, he had himself carried out on a mattress, and directed his men how to make preparations for the siege. During the siege, the quarrels between the French and the English kings often prevented anything being carried out, but when they did at length act together, they forced Saladin, the brave leader of the Mohammedans, to surrender. After the Crusaders took possession of Acre, King Philip returned to France, and Richard was left to carry on the war. He marched southwards towards Jerusalem, which he intended to take, but which, after all, he never even attacked. Disputes and divisions broke out amongst the leaders of the army, and between Richard and the Duke of Austria. In particular, there grew up an enmity as bitter as that had existed between Richard and the King of France. There are many stories told about the account for this enmity, one of them being that, at the time of the siege of Acre, Richard seized the Austrian flag, which was waving on the ramparts, and flung it into the ditch. The story may or may not be true, but if it is, Richard paid dearly afterwards for having, in a momentary fit of temper, insulted the pride of the Duke of Austria. After coming almost within sight of Jerusalem, the army of the Crusaders turned back. We are told that before turning back, Richard was led up to the top of a hill, from which the sacred city could be seen. But Richard would not look upon the city he was leaving, while his guide pointed before him to the buildings dimly visible in the distance. The shame-stricken king held up his shield before his face. What feelings must he have had when, as he slowly descended the hill, he thought of what it might have been, but for those unworthy quarrels amongst the leaders of the Christian host, when he thought that, but for these, he might have seen the Christian cross flash on the roof of the mosque, where it had stood for nearly a century, until torn down by the victorious Mohammedans 5 years before. So sadly and sorrowfully Richard sailed away from the Holy Land. As its shores slowly faded from his sights, he stretched out his arm towards it and exclaimed, "Most Holy Land, I commend thee to the care of the Almighty. May He grant me life to return and deliver thee from the yoke of the Mohammedans." It was not owing to want or will, or want of courage, at least, that he left in the hands of the Mohammedans there. During the year of more since his first coming to the Holy Land, Richard had given signal proofs of his great strength and daring in many attacks upon the enemy. His name was feared and honoured by the Mohammedans over all the land, and even after his time, we are told, the Arab would exclaim to his horse when it started and pricked up his ears, "Dost think it King Richard?" The English fleet reached Sicily in safety, but the vessel in which the king was sailing, with a few followers, was tossed about and driven ashore, and after several mishaps, Richard found himself wandering about the country of his enemy, the Duke of Austria, accompanied by one knight and a boy, his followers having been seized and imprisoned. For a while Richard, disguised as a pilgrim, and with his beard unshaven, wandered on without being recognized, but at last he fell into the hands of the Duke, who took care not to lose the opportunity to avenging himself for the insults he had suffered in the Holy Land. Richard was placed in a strong castle, where he remained closely guarded for about 4 months. There is a pretty story told of how, when the people of England were all in ignorance of the whereabouts of their king, Richard's faithful minstrel, Blondel, set out to find his master, how he wandered about for a long time without finding a trace of him, and how, at last, one day, when, wearied with his wanderings, he had sat down to rest outside the walls of a strong castle of Trifels, the notes of an old French song which Richard used to sing floated out to his ears. Eagerly the minstrel took up the song, and sang aloud and clearly the following verse, then listened, breathless and with beating heart. Again the voice within, the voice which now the faithful minstrel knew to be the king's, took up the strain. Then, wild with joy, Blondel set forth, and told how he had at last found the king, and soon Richard was set free by the payment of a large ransom, which his poor subjects were heavily taxed to make up. History does not vouch for the truth of Blondel's part in this story. There is no doubt that the king was set free on payment of a heavy ransom and returned to England. He did not remain long in his kingdom, however. Not long after his return, he heard that his estates in France had been attacked, and he hastened over to the continent to protect them. There he was wounded during a siege, and died before he was able to fulfill his vow to lead another crusade to the Holy Land.